The Millionaire's twins were believed to be completely blind, until a new black maid uncovered a secret that changed everything. High above the coastal town of Briarwood, Maine, sat an estate that overlooked the restless Atlantic. Its owner, Howard Langston, was known far and wide as a man who had built his fortune in shipping and investments. He had wealth, status, and a mansion that seemed pulled from the pages of a magazine. But inside those grand stone walls, sorrow lingered like an unwelcome guest. Howard's twins, Caleb and Sophie, had been born 12 years earlier under the weight of heartbreak. Doctors had delivered the news within hours of their birth. Both children were blind, their eyes unresponsive to light. Howard and his wife, Diana, had clung to hope, flying in specialists and seeking miracles in every corner of the country. But every answer came back the same: nothing could restore their sight. When Diana passed away suddenly from illness a few years later, Howard was left to raise the twins alone. He filled the house with staff and private tutors, determined that Caleb and Sophie would not suffer for lack of resources. Yet, for all his wealth, he could not give them what they longed for most: the ability to see the world around them. Over time, his relentless pursuit of a cure turned into resignation. He told himself he had done all he could. By 12, Caleb and Sophie lived in a world shaped almost entirely by sound and touch. Tutors taught them music, nannies guided them through routines, and the staff moved about with hushed voices and careful steps, as if afraid the children might shatter if spoken to too loudly. The twins smiled politely, but behind those smiles was a weariness too heavy for children to bear. Then one spring morning, a new figure entered the Langston mansion. Her name was Marjorie Fields, a woman in her late 30s whose life had been far from easy. Raised in a small Georgia town by her aunt, Marjorie had worked since she was a teenager, cooking, cleaning, and caring for others to make ends meet. She had a teenage son back home, and though money was always tight, she carried herself with quiet strength. From the moment she walked through the heavy oak doors, Marjorie noticed how different this household felt. It was grand, yes, but heavy with silence. When she met the twins, she crouched down to their level and introduced herself plainly. "Good morning, Caleb." "Good morning, Sophie. I'm Marjorie. I'll be helping out around here, but I promise I won't hover unless you want me to." The twins turned their faces toward her voice. Caleb's lips quirked into a faint smile, while Sophie tilted her head curiously. They were used to adults speaking either in loud, pitying tones or slow, exaggerated words, as though blindness meant they couldn't understand. Marjorie's voice was steady and respectful, spoken to them, not at them. Over the next days, Marjorie observed quietly. She admired how Caleb could memorize entire passages from books after hearing them once, and how Sophie could identify a person by the rhythm of their footsteps. But there was something else, something small yet undeniable. When she opened the curtains in the morning, Caleb's eyes, though clouded, shifted slightly toward the sunlight. When she set silverware on the dining table, Sophie's head turned faintly toward the glint of metal catching the light. At first, Marjorie told herself it was coincidence. But she saw it again, and again. It was too consistent to ignore. One evening, as she tucked them into bed, she asked gently, "Do you ever see anything at all?" "Not clearly, just shadows, maybe colors." The question made them both go still. Caleb's hand clutched the blanket, and Sophie whispered, "We're not supposed to say." Marjorie's brow furrowed. "Not supposed to say? Who told you that?" "The doctors," Caleb admitted, his voice soft but edged with pain. "When we said we saw flashes or shapes, they told Dad it wasn't real. They said we were just imagining it. After a while, we stopped talking about it." Marjorie's heart tightened. These children hadn't just been silenced by blindness, they had been silenced by disbelief. She reached for their hands, her voice warm but firm. "Don't let anyone convince you what you see doesn't matter. Even the smallest flicker of light is still real. You don't have to hide it from me." For the first time in years, Caleb and Sophie smiled, not the polite smiles reserved for staff, but genuine, relieved ones. From then on, Marjorie began to test them quietly. She lit a candle in the far corner of the room and asked where the glow was coming from. She wore scarves of different colors and casually asked which seemed brighter. To her astonishment, the twins responded with surprising accuracy. Caleb could tell when a lamp had been switched on across the room. Sophie could distinguish between the deep blur of red and the softer haze of blue. Hope swelled inside Marjorie, but so did fear. Would Howard Langston, a man hardened by years of disappointment, believe her if she told him? Or would he dismiss her just as the doctors had dismissed the children's voices? What Marjorie didn't realize was that her decision to act would change not only Caleb and Sophie's lives, but the heart of the entire Langston household. And as this story unfolds, you'll see how one woman's courage to believe in two children became the spark that changed everything. Marjorie carried the secret of Caleb and Sophie's hidden vision heavily on her shoulders for several days. She watched the children with growing certainty, her heart aching every time she saw their hesitant attempts to describe what they weren't supposed to see. Every test she made, every little experiment, convinced her more, these children weren't completely blind. But how was she to tell their father? Howard Langston was not an easy man to approach. She had seen him pacing through the marble halls in his tailored suits, always preoccupied, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression locked in the armor of a man who refused to be hurt again. Staff whispered about how he buried himself in work, how he rarely smiled, and how no one dared bring him false hope regarding his children. Still, Marjorie couldn't keep silent. One evening, after the children had gone to sleep, she found Howard in his study. The room smelled faintly of leather and old books, the fire casting warm shadows on the oak-paneled walls. Howard sat behind his desk, his eyes on a stack of papers though his mind was clearly elsewhere. "Mr. Langston," Marjorie began carefully. Howard looked up, his face stern but tired. "Yes, Marjorie. Is something wrong with the twins?" Her hands twisted slightly in front of her, but she stood tall. "Not wrong, sir. Different. I believe Caleb and Sophie can see more than anyone has been willing to admit." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then Howard leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "I've heard this before. Doctors, therapists, even well-meaning staff, they all thought they saw something. It always led nowhere. Do you think I want to believe? Of course I do. But I won't set them up for another disappointment." Marjorie's voice softened, but it did not waver. "With respect, sir, this isn't about what you want to believe. It's about what they've been made to hide. They see flickers, colors, shadows. They told me themselves. The only reason they don't say anything to you is because they were told no one would believe them." Howard's eyes darkened. "Who told them that?" "The doctors. And, indirectly, you." The word stung. Howard's lips parted, ready to defend himself, but the truth in her tone silenced him. He turned his gaze toward the fire, his face caught between anger and sorrow. Marjorie took a step closer. "They need someone to believe them. If you can't, then they'll keep pretending. And the chance they might have, whatever it is, will fade away." Howard rubbed a hand across his face, his composure cracking. For years, he had lived under the weight of despair, convincing himself there was no point in chasing miracles. The thought that his own children might have been silenced by that despair pierced him deeper than any failure in business ever could. "Show me," he said finally, his voice low. "If what you're saying is true, prove it to me." The very next evening, Marjorie prepared a simple test in the library. She asked the twins to join her, while Howard stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching with skeptical eyes. "Caleb, Sophie," Marjorie said gently, "I'm going to hold up something. Tell me what you notice." She lit a candle and placed it across the room. Caleb turned his head toward the faint glow. "It's light. Like a soft ball in the dark." Howard stiffened, his eyes narrowing. Marjorie then held up 2 scarves. One red, one blue. Sophie, do these look the same, or different? Sophie hesitated, then whispered, different. The second one feels softer on my eyes. The first is, sharper. Is that red? Howard's heart lurched. For the next several minutes, Marjorie repeated the tests, simple yet undeniable. Each time, the twins responded with quiet certainty. Howard stood frozen, his chest rising and falling heavily as the truth unfolded before him. His children weren't living in complete darkness. When the tests ended, Sophie turned toward the sound of her father's breath. "Daddy," she asked timidly. "Do you believe us now?" The question shattered him. Howard dropped to his knees, gathering both children into his arms. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Yes. I believe you. I'm so sorry I didn't before." Tears he hadn't shed in years burned his eyes as he held them close. For so long, he had walled off his heart to protect himself from disappointment, not realizing he had been shutting out the very people who needed him most. From that night forward, everything in the Langston household began to shift. Howard contacted specialists again, but this time, with proof and determination. He hired new doctors willing to listen, not dismiss. He arranged for advanced testing in Boston, despite the skepticism of some. For once, he wasn't just throwing money at the problem, he was standing beside his children, hand in hand, believing in them. And through it all, Marjorie remained a steady presence. She encouraged Caleb and Sophie, helped them embrace what they could see, and reminded them that their voices mattered. Where others had given them pity, she gave them respect. Where others saw limitation, she saw possibility. But the journey was far from simple. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some of the longtime staff whispered that Marjorie was filling the family's head with false hope, that it was dangerous to believe too much. One tutor even confronted her, saying, "You're setting those children up for heartbreak. Don't you think they've had enough?" Marjorie met those words with quiet steel. Heartbreak doesn't come from hope. It comes from silence and disbelief. And I refuse to silence them. Yet, despite her strength, doubt sometimes crept into her own heart. What if she was wrong? What if their faint glimpses never grew stronger, and all she had done was open wounds that would never heal? Still, every time Caleb or Sophie smiled with newfound confidence, those doubts faded. For the first time in their young lives, the twins felt seen, not for what they lacked, but for what they carried inside. And slowly, even Howard began to change. He spent less time locked away in his study and more time with his children. He laughed again. Clumsy, at first, as though he had forgotten how. He asked Caleb to play the piano for him at night. He listened as Sophie described the fuzzy colors she noticed during sunsets. The mansion, once heavy with silence, began to fill with life. But what none of them knew was that their journey was only just beginning. The truth Marjorie uncovered would lead them down a path of trials, breakthroughs, and choices that would test not only the strength of the twins but the very bond of their family. Weeks passed, and the Langston family's life was no longer what it once had been. Instead of routines shaped by silence and resignation, there was now a current of energy in the mansion, as if hope itself had taken up residence there. Howard threw himself into supporting Caleb and Sophie, arranging appointments with specialists in Boston, New York, and even across the country. Unlike in the past, he didn't sit on the sidelines this time. He went into every exam room, held his children's hands, and demanded doctors listen to what they were experiencing. Some physicians remained skeptical, insisting the children's reports were imagination or neurological misfires. But others saw possibility and urged further testing. Marjorie, meanwhile, stayed grounded in the everyday moments. She was the one who coached the twins through little exercises at home, asking Caleb to follow a beam of light with his eyes, encouraging Sophie to describe the faint hues she detected in a painting hung near the staircase. She celebrated every small success as if it were monumental, and to the twins, it was. For the first time, their experiences were being validated. But along with progress came setbacks. After a particularly hopeful exam, a specialist in Boston delivered sobering news: there's a chance your children have limited vision potential, but it may never develop beyond shadows and indistinct shapes. You must prepare yourself for that reality. The words cut deeply. On the ride home, Howard sat in silence, his grip tight on the steering wheel, while Caleb and Sophie shifted uneasily in the back seat. It was Sophie who finally whispered, "Daddy, are you disappointed?" Howard pulled the car over to the side of the road. He turned in his seat, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "No, sweetheart. I'm proud of you. I'll never be disappointed in you, not for what you can or can't see. I just wish I had believed in you sooner." The twins leaned forward, wrapping their arms around him, and in that embrace, the heaviness began to ease. Back at the mansion, Marjorie continued to remind Howard that progress wasn't measured only in medical reports. "They're braver, stronger, and more confident than they've ever been," she said one evening in the kitchen. "That's worth more than what any chart says." Howard studied her with gratitude. "I don't know how we would have gotten here without you, Marjorie." Her eyes softened, but she shook her head. "I didn't give them sight. They already had it. I just believed what was in front of me." It was true, but she had given them something far greater, the courage to trust themselves. In the months that followed, Caleb and Sophie flourished in ways no one could have predicted. Caleb began experimenting with painting, using bold strokes guided partly by touch and partly by the faint outlines he could perceive. His work was abstract yet powerful, and Howard found himself standing before the canvases for long stretches, marveling at what his son was expressing. Sophie, meanwhile, discovered a love for gardening. With Marjorie's help, she tended to flowers in the courtyard, describing the colors she thought she saw. At first she hesitated, fearing she might be wrong, but Marjorie encouraged her, "There's no wrong answer. If you see it, then it's real to you." Over time, Sophie's confidence grew, and she began calling herself the color finder, giggling each time she spotted a difference in the brightness of blossoms. The Langston mansion, once a place of sorrow, was now filled with laughter and warmth. Staff who had once tiptoed through the halls found themselves smiling at the sound of music drifting from the piano or the sight of Sophie tugging Marjorie toward the garden. Even Howard seemed reborn, no longer the stiff, distant man who buried himself in work, but a father present in his children's world. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Caleb asked, "Dad, do you think Mom would be proud of us?" Howard's throat tightened. "She would be more than proud. She would be overjoyed. And I think she's with us, every step of the way." The children leaned into him, comforted, and Marjorie watched from her chair nearby, her heart swelling with quiet joy. She had come to Briarwood for a job, nothing more. She never expected to become part of a family's healing, or to be the one who unearthed a truth that changed everything. Yet even as peace settled over the Langston estate, Marjorie knew the journey wasn't finished. The twins' vision might never be fully restored, but what mattered more was that they no longer lived under silence or disbelief. They had been given back their voices, their courage, and their hope. And in many ways, Howard, too, had been given a second chance, not just as a father, but as a man who had learned that the greatest wealth isn't found in bank accounts or properties, but in the moments when you choose to believe in the people you love. As Marjorie walked through the mansion halls that night, she paused by a window overlooking the Atlantic. The moon cast silver ripples across the waves, and she whispered softly to herself, "Sometimes miracles don't come in the way we expect. Sometimes, they come when someone finally listens." The story of the Langston twins, once believed to be blind, now living with newfound vision and unshakable belief, would become one remembered not for riches or tragedy, but for the courage of two children, the love of a father, and the strength of a woman who dared to see what others refused. And perhaps, for everyone who hears it, the lesson remains the same: never silence the truth in someone else's heart, because what seems impossible may only be waiting for belief.